group. Alonge is an impact-focused leader with 15 plus years experience advising some of the world's leading organizations. As CEO of a data-driven equality, diversity and inclusion consultancy, the Equal Group, Mac leads a multidisciplinary team delivering EDI transformation projects with organizations across public, private and voluntary sectors. And when asked what philosophy do you live by, Mac answered like this: we are all individually and collectively living life for the first time. Everyone is making it up as they go. So please join me in welcoming Mac.
Sure. Okay, cool. Thank you so much for inviting me here today, and apologies for the delay. Travelling back from London, stuck in traffic. But as Jasmine said, my name is Mac. I am CEO of the Equal Group, but my story begins a lot earlier than that. So I'll dig a little bit into my story, kind of give you an insight into what led me to this point, and I guess formally been asked to speak about individualism versus collectivism. So what does it mean in the context of equality, diversity and inclusion, which is basically what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'll be thinking about, or talking about organisations, but also individuals. So how do we become more equitable, more diverse and more inclusive? So rather self-centeredly, there's a massive picture of me. I'm going to apologise now because there's a couple of me, but they serve a purpose. It's not just vanity. But essentially for the last 15 years I've been working with leadership teams to really dig a little bit deeper into their most pressing strategic issues. Formerly as an energy consultant, so regulatory consultant, focused on regulation in the energy sector, so gas, electricity, water and metering. Really giving leaders an understanding of what's going on in their business currently, but also how that landscape might change in 5, 10, 15 years time. Typically using data, and not to bore you, the energy sector has masses of information about pipe sizes, meter sizes, line loss factors, efficiency ratios, you name it, they track it. But they track it purposefully to ensure that systems and infrastructure is designed accordingly. However, when we look at equality, diversity, inclusion, the data is lacking. And that's a problem that I kind of saw as I progressed through my career. Essentially, we kind of call it the snowy peaks effect. So when you're at entry level, it's quite diverse, there's different people from different backgrounds. The higher you get, the more white and middle-aged and middle class the environment becomes. But as somebody that was focused on leadership teams, kind of exclusively, I was typically the only person in the room that didn't go to private school, typically the only person from an ethnic minority background, typically the only person that didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, and I found that environment really weird, I guess is the word I would use to sum it up. I say it's weird because we are all consumers of energy, we are all consumers of electricity, water, we all pay our bills, yet the decisions being made at a strategic level are all made by white, middle-aged, middle-class men. And again, that felt weird for me. So I say that to say, throughout my career, it was a reoccurring theme to say what is going on in this environment, what is going on that leads us to this point where all of our organisations are led by the same type of person. So a little bit about the work that we do. I don't really want to dwell too much on this, but now we focus on equality, diversity and inclusion and using data as the kind of key foundation for that. I'll dig into that a little bit later on. In the context of this session, and when we talk about individualism and collectivism, I was really kind of trying to sum it up and simplify it. I don't think it is a simple subject matter like individualism versus collectivism. Really deep, really meaningful. You can spend hours and hours and hours talking about it. I'm not suggesting we do that because I'm sure people are tired and got things to do, but I kind of looked into it in terms of the 4 factors of life. And I'm not going to take credit for this because I looked on LinkedIn, a guy called Nick James had kind of positioned these 4 things as being fundamental to life. There are other things that are fundamental to life also, but I thought it would be worth just digging into these a little bit. So on the individual side, health and well-being, so essentially our health, our well-being is the foundation upon which everything is built. So if we're not healthy, if we're not looking after ourselves, life kind of falls over. Also on an individual side of things, our friends and family, so those are kind of the people that we choose, the people that are closest to us, the people that we have the deepest relationships with. So that's kind of what we look at individual, that's kind of what we've got fundamental control over. We fundamentally control how healthy we are, to some extent. Obviously there's health issues and all kinds of things, but fundamentally we have usually some say in how healthy we are and our own personal well-being. We also have a little bit of say, especially as we get older, in the friends and the family that we keep. On the collective side of things, and this is more about society, work and education. And by work, it's about what we choose to spend, or what we spend our time doing purposefully, but also in relation to financial benefit, essentially what we trade our time for. And then on the education side of things, how we learn, how we're informed, not just formal education, but social media, everything that we consume that shapes our views, shapes our ideologies. I think earlier in life that's essentially imposed on us to some extent. I'm not a fan of the education system, but I'm not going to spend too much time bashing it yet. But the education system, and then later on in life we choose what education we engage with, whether that's further education or informal education. I think we're in quite a pivotal time now where we can actually educate ourselves and take responsibility and ownership for what it is that we consume on a day-to-day basis, both positive and negative. And I think I'm not going to get into social media again because I could be here talking all day, but algorithms and the way that information is fed to us can be problematic, but we do have some control over it to some extent. So those are the kind of four things that I thought about when we're thinking about individualism versus collectivism, and I really want to focus on the collectivism side of things currently. But before I do, more pictures of me, but I promise they are purposeful. So the first picture on kind of your left-hand side is me as a youngster, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my primary school education. So I was born in Liverpool, grew up in South East London, and my primary school was really diverse. People from different communities. I remember speaking to you last time about the school was next to a Sikh temple, Gurdwara, and they used to invite us over for food, for snacks, and just essentially love us and kind of communicate with us and demonstrate what community looks like and role model that. But the environment was super diverse in terms of Roma Gypsies, we had Sikhs, we had Hindus, we had East Asians, Southeast Asians, just everybody from every walk of life you can imagine. And it was super enjoyable. You learned so much about different people's cultures, there was no real barriers, it was quite a working class community, but finance was never really a thing that you care about as like a 8-year-old, 7-year-old, whatever. So it was enjoyable, and I really loved education. I loved the school, I loved the activities and time. And then once I left primary school, went to secondary school, I went to a grammar school which was 3 miles from where Stephen Lawrence was murdered, a couple of years after that. And for anyone that knows that environment, it's pretty racist, pretty right-wing. It used to be the BNP's national headquarters, and there was just an air of racism, and it was palpable when you walked into the school. It was kind of the first time that I'd really grappled with what does it mean to be working class, what does it mean to be middle class, what does it mean to be upper class. And as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, you don't really know about racism, you don't really know about systemic oppression. You don't have the words for it, you don't have the vocabulary for it, but you are impacted by it. And I felt deeply impacted by it. I felt like my chances, my opportunities were limited. I felt like I wasn't given the same license as my peers. I felt like I wasn't necessarily given the same opportunities. So I kind of just ended up coasting through. But it really crushed me in terms of whether or not I enjoyed education. And I kind of convinced myself that education wasn't for me. And that is quite a damaging lie that I took on. But anyway, that's kind of the environment. So it was super individualistic, super competitive. And I really wanted to reflect on the education system in this country, because as much as we can be in rooms like this and talk about collectivism and how we all need to develop community and work together, from a very young age we're taught that it's individualism that matters, so we're graded individually. It's all about you versus your peer. You're not really taught to collaborate. Your deep self-interest is pushed in you in terms of what are your grades, what are your GCSEs, what school are you going to. It's never about the collective, it's never about how we all learn to be better human beings. It's always about grades, academic achievement, and one way of kind of seeing the world, which again, when we think about neurodiversity, doesn't necessarily lend itself to people that are creative or people that don't necessarily learn through being talked at. Anyway, the environment was too competitive, quite hostile and quite challenging. And that's kind of a common thread that followed me through to the workplace, where in the early days of my career in the energy sector, as I said, snowy peaks, quite diverse at entry level, but the more you progress, the worse the environment gets. So I found the first couple of years of my energy sector experience to be quite enjoyable, quite challenging, quite a unifying environment. Everybody's kind of learning the subject matter for the first time. There's a little bit of camaraderie, a little bit of community. But then, as I said, as you progress, it becomes a little bit more competitive, a little bit more hostile, and people are deeply self-interested in terms of their career, their progression, and how they can get ahead. So that kind of towards the end of my career in the energy sector, so after 10 years, I really started thinking about this landscape leadership. What does it mean? What does it look like? And as I said, it was very male-dominated, very private school-dominated, very Oxford-dominated. I started to think about the parallels with my secondary school environment. So I went to a grammar school, quite elitist, a lot of kind of middle-class, upper-class kids. But I really reflected on this first question, which is why are elite, quote-unquote elite, organisations or institutions so homogenous? Why do we always see the same type of people in the same types of places? And the second question was, again, related to what I was talking about around we're all consumers of energy, we're all paying our bills, so why does the leadership reflect the few? Why don't we have more diverse leadership teams? Why don't we have more diverse organisations generally? So one of the questions that kind of comes to mind is, does society function for the many or the few? So that was kind of my individualistic journey, thinking about myself in the context of society, how it's shaped, and kind of what the issues I felt were during the position as the first half of my life. I'm not sure how long I'm going to live, but let's just call it half. So moving forward, it kind of planted a seed in me to, there was one thing that I actually wanted to mention about the environment that society breeds. This doesn't seem to be working.
Do you want to go forward?
Backwards, 2 slides, please. Yeah. So it actually came up in conversation before this session in terms of the weaponization of ambition. So when we think about how we as individuals get ahead, and typically something that we experience as, and I say we, I'm not sure everyone's background, but we, myself and my family, when we come from working class backgrounds, we tend to be ambitious, we tend to want to achieve as a way to escape economically the conditions that we grew up in. And when we talk about ambition and the weaponization of ambition, it's how the system, again we can spend all day defining the system rewards you for kind of forgetting where you've come from and getting to a certain level. And again, I see that as a weaponization of ambition to say, how do we reward you individually and incentivize you to act as an individual, forgetting the collective, forgetting the community, forgetting your obligation as a human being to make sure that you're not stepping over other people. But environments like the KPMGs of this world really weaponize individual ambition to say, how are you going to get ahead? How are you going to be paid more? How are you going to progress? forget everyone else. And it's not just KPMG, I know it's being recorded, but there are other organisations. So I say that to say this planted a seed in me to really look at what does diversity mean, what does inclusion mean, what does equity or equality mean in the context of society and how we work generally. And that's where the idea of the Equal Group started. So this is the team as it stood a couple of months ago. We try to be intentionally diverse, intentionally inclusive, so there are people from all walks of life, all shapes and sizes, all different experiences, lived experiences and conditions, and also positioned all over the UK. So we really want to kind of focus on diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and try to bring that to the fore when we talk to organisations about how they do things. But essentially we've started with 4 fundamental wires, essentially, as our kind of foundation. So one is to ensure that difference isn't a barrier for the next generation. So we've all grown up thinking that if you are from a different background, that limits your ability to progress. We don't want that to continue to be true for future generations. We want everybody individually and organisationally to understand what good looks like from an equality, diversity, inclusion perspective. So we focus on education, we focus on ensuring that people understand what best practice is. We want EDI to be wholly embedded into organisations, so the same way that every organisation thinks about finance, the same way that every organisation thinks about technology, the same way that every organisation should think about their consumers. We want organisations to think about how diverse, inclusive and equitable they are. And then we want to live in an environment where inclusive behaviour is actively and proactively incentivised, so ensuring that the opposite of what's happening now in terms of people being incentivised to be exclusive, to be kind of focused on self, as I talked about before, in terms of environments with organisations such as KPMG and others. Essentially the incentive is for you to act in a way that doesn't necessarily benefit everybody, but it benefits yourself. So we want the reverse of that to be true. And we position ourselves in the middle of that to say that we want to be the architect of what good equality, diversity and inclusion looks like in the workplace. So our mission is essentially to unleash the full potential of organisations. When we talk about organisations, we talk quite broadly, using equality, diversity, inclusion, identifying bias, eliminating it in the workplace, and data is at the heart of everything we do. So I'll touch on that a little bit later. Essentially our vision is to enable a business world without bias. So I'll talk about data a little bit, but essentially we believe that both quantitative and qualitative data needs to be the foundation of everything we do around equality, diversity and inclusion. So ensuring that we have metrics, but not just metrics, we also have insights in terms of how different groups of people feel, looking at intersectionality, so understanding the multitude of conditions or environments or experiences that we have, that we bring into the workplace, and making sure that we have the ability to track progress over time. So we use data as a starting point, we set operational, we identify operational gaps, so that may be gaps in different levels of the organisation or different demographics. We then work with organisations to set strategic targets, so where are you now, where do you want to be, and then work with them to close that gap. And the intention is for that to be a continual process, so making sure that organisations are continually monitoring this and that it's embedded. Just as a little bit of context, I know we talk about equality, diversity and inclusion quite loosely, but we look at it kind of from a regulatory perspective, which it looks at the legal parameters that are essentially legislated against, so 9 protected characteristics, age, gender, etc., etc. We can then broaden out into things like language and class, education, approach, appearance, and then broaden that still within an organisational context, teams that you're in, the functions that you have, the roles that you have, etc. So that's just to give a little bit of context as to what we talk about. It's not just gender, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just disability, but it moves kind of more broadly than that. A couple of organisations that we've worked with, just for context. And I just want to talk a little bit about some work that we've done. And again, this is just to give a little bit of context in terms of the link for me, between the individual and the collective. So within organisations, we do an audit, so we'll go in and we'll survey the staff members to understand what their individual views are, what their perspectives are, how they see the organisation. And that's a very kind of one-to-one bilateral individual activity. We then aggregate that up across the organisation to understand what does that look like in the context of the collective. So we start with the individual and then end up with a collective picture of where organisations are. But the individual contributes to that, and the more individual ideas and thoughts and perspectives we can get, the better equipped we are to understand collectively what action we need to take, where we need to target intervention, and how we need to prioritise that from an organisational perspective. So one of our key metrics is disclosure or participation rates, and we pride ourselves in being able to help organisations hit 80% plus disclosure. And that's really important to say that as many individuals contribute as possible gives us the ability to start to really tackle some of the issues that we're seeing in organisations. So we've done some work with new to management consultancy. They specialise in operational transformation, but really they were quite sceptical. And I think it's a good kind of a good case study because essentially their whole origin story is that they only recruit the brightest and best. When you ask them what that means, they only recruit people or they previously only recruited people from Oxford and Cambridge. So straight away you can see that there are problematic ideologies about what the brightest and the best means. So we worked with them to really understand what some of their issues were and found that, it's not going to be a shock to many people in this room, but women were feeling underappreciated, underserved, as well as ethnic minorities. And that is largely to do with their internal processes and structures. One of the things that stuck out to their managing director was a comment from a young lady. So when we do these audits, we look at both the numbers, but also give people the opportunity to, in their own words, say what the issues are that they're grappling with. One young lady said that she really enjoyed her career, she really wanted to have a family one day, and didn't see how she could do the two at the same time. And the managing director sat up in a leadership meeting and said, right, this is something that should be really easy to fix. We need to fix it to make sure that we're not losing good people. But that for me shows the power of actually people's stories and giving people a voice to address what issues are concerning to them. Anyway, long story short, we've been working with them for a couple of years, and fundamentally they've changed the way that they see equality, diversity and inclusion. Please say they no longer just recruit from Oxford and Cambridge, they recruit from a number of different universities. Again, it's a little bit problematic because universities are still the way in. We've got some work to do. It's progress in the right direction. And they've taken on kind of full-time equality, diversity and inclusion lead and are fundamentally changing the way that they do things. So I say that to say there is power in individual stories, there is power in individuals really recognising their voice and having power and agency for identifying what issues they face, and then collectively we can hopefully work towards better processes, better procedures, and a more inclusive environment. So, I've been asked to give you a couple of questions just to grapple with for the next, I'm not sure. Okay, cool. So, can I still go through questions?
Yeah.
Alright, so the first question is it possible to be fully inclusive as an organisation or an individual? How do we deal with conflicting worldviews versus freedom of speech? And finally, can the inclusion of some lead to the exclusion of others? So, so that's me. Do feel free to connect with me or the Equal Group online. I'll be around for the rest of the session to answer any questions. But thank you so much for listening.